Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another video on the road to 2000. So today I have another game. As you can see, I'm playing as white. So without wasting any time, let's get into the game. On this game, I started with the king's pawn opening with pawn to e4. Then my opponent also responded with the king's pawn opening with pawn to e5. Then I played knight to f3, attacking the king's pawn. My opponent responded with knight to c6, protecting the king's pawn. So after that, I played the queen's pawn to d4, playing the Scotch game. And then my opponent took with the pawn. Then I took back with the knight. But in this position, there's I'm not sure if it's a gambit or it's a trade where you play knight to g5. As you can see, the computer doesn't like that very much. Of course, the queen cannot take because the knight is protected by the bishop. And if your opponent in this position tries to attack with this pawn, you can just take here. And then when your opponent takes with the king, you play bishop to c4 with a check. And then if the kings go back, it's over. You can play queen to h5, and then you can play the sequence that leads to mate e5. But I don't advise you to play that. But maybe if you're playing on blitz or bullet, you can try it. But after my opponent takes the queen's pawn, I take back with the knight, and then my opponent didn't take back, sorry. Instead, played bishop to c5, increasing the attack on my knight. And then after that, I played knight to c6, capturing my opponent's knight, and then my opponent captures back with the pawn, which is an inaccuracy. The best move in this position is to capture with this pawn, which is a book move. It's not really a best move, it's just a book move. That's the move that you have to play when your opponent takes the knight on c6. And then my opponent didn't take with that pawn, took with the other pawn, and then I took the queen, which is the best move. And then my opponent was forced to take with the king, and then I played knight to c3. My opponent then played knight to f6. I'm attacking my pawn, but the pawn is already protected. So I just continued with my development, playing bishop to d3, increasing the protection on the pawn in the center. After that, my opponent played rook to e8. That was the idea all along. Hence, I played the bishop first before the move rook to e8 was played. After that, I just castled the king side. Then my opponent played bishop to d4, and then I played rook to e1. The reason I played rook to e1 was to increase the protection, because the idea of my opponent playing bishop to d4 was to capture this knight, and now the only piece that's protecting that pawn is the bishop, so my opponent can win that pawn. So that's the reason why I played a rook to e1. So after that, my opponent took the knight, then I took back with the pawn, which is the best move. And then my opponent played bishop to e6. And then I played bishop to g5, pinning the knight to the king. My opponent then played pawn to d5, which is a mistake. There's moves like pawn to h6, which is the best move, kicking away the bishop. So of course my opponent didn't play that move. Instead played pawn to b5, which is a mistake, and then I played pawn to e5. Now because the knight is pinned to the king, the knight cannot move. But in this position, my opponent can always defend with playing pawn to h6. Then I took the knight, and my opponent took back my bishop. And then I took the pawn on g7. And after that, my opponent played rook to g8, trying to capture that pawn. And then I played rook to rook to d1. Of course, it's an inaccuracy because I'm leaving my pawn to be captured, but capturing the pawn is a plan, as you can see. Hence I played rook to rook to d1. Then my opponent played king to e7. And then I played pawn to c4, looking for the pawn exchange. My opponent didn't accept, instead played pawn to a6, and then I took the pawn, which is an inaccuracy. But my opponent took back with the other pawn, and then I played pawn to c4, which is the best move. and then my opponent didn't take, instead took the pawn that was being attacked by the rook, the pawn on g7, and then I took the pawn, and then my opponent took back with the pawn, then I took back with the bishop. And then in this position, my opponent played the rook to e2, capturing the pawn, which is the best move. And then I played rook to d7 with a check, and then the king moved to f6, which is the perfect square for the king. There's also the other square here, but that's not the best move. The best move is to move the king to f6. Then after that, my opponent, I took the pawn, and then my opponent played rook to b2. And then I played bishop to c4. The best move in this position was to play bishop to d7. They are both bishop exchanging moves. So playing bishop to d7 was the best move, but I played bishop to c4. And my opponent didn't go for the exchange, instead played rook to g8. Then I took the bishop. In this position, the best move was to play rook to c2, but I already seen that because I can play my rook to c6. Now the bishop cannot capture the bishop because it's pinned to the king. So I calculated that before playing the bishop to that square. After my opponent played rook to g8, I then took the bishop, and then my opponent took back with the pawn. Then I played pawn to g3, trying to avoid any bank rank checkmate. My opponent then played rook to d8. Then I played rook to c6, pinning the pawn to the king. Then my opponent played the rook to e1, protecting the pawn, because the pawn was being attacked by the two rooks, and the only piece that was protecting the pawn was the king. Hence my opponent played rook to e8, which is the best move. And then I played king to g2. My opponent then played king to f5. Then I played pawn to h3. Then my opponent made the blunder, which leads to mate in2. And now in this position, the game was just over. There's a couple of moves that my opponent could have played, like playing pawn here. It's an inaccuracy, but it's not a bad move because the king has squares to move, but this loses this pawn. So, but the computer says this is a miss. Let's see why this is a miss. Oh, there's a better move that I could have played in this position. Yeah. Oh, pawn to... The pawn cannot move, so I don't know what's the best move for me in this position. White capturing this pawn is a mistake, but now that didn't happen. So let's continue to where the game actually happened. Or let's continue. After I played pawn to h3, my opponent played pawn to e5, which is a mistake. And then in this position, I just played the mate in2 with pawn to g4. As you can see, it's a great move with a check. And now the king has only one square to go to f4, and then I played rook to f6 with a checkmate. So that's how the game ended, and I'm not sure if this is I think it's the end game of two rooks and kings. So I guess it's an end game. So that's how the game ended, and I capitalized on my opponent's mistake, but I was already having a huge advantage on the game, so I was probably going to win even if my opponent didn't play like that. But that's how the game ended. So thank you for watching. Please subscribe, like, comment, and share if you can. And until we see each other on the next video, thank you for watching.